Xerox PARC, of course, is the legendary research and development organization founded by Xerox in the early 70s, when Xerox was the preeminent high-tech firm of its age. Founded by Xerox in Palo Alto to imagine the future. And they built this gorgeous modernist building, and they nestle it in the hills above Stanford University. And they go out and they hire 60 or 70 of the most brilliant computer scientists in the world. And they give them their own palatial private office, and they double their salaries, and they give them unlimited research budgets, and they say to them, take all the time you want, we just want you to imagine the future of the office. And that's exactly what they do. Virtually everything that we associate with the computer age, the personal computer age, is invented at Xerox PARC in the 1970s. They're the first ones to really build a functional, integrated personal computer. Right? It's called the Alta. They're the first one. They invent the laser printer. They invent the Ethernet. They invent Windows. They invent the graphical user interface, the idea of having icons on a screen manipulated by a mouse. I could go on and on. Everything comes from Xerox PARC. Well, in December of 1979, Xerox PARC is visited by a young entrepreneur with a little company down the road in Cupertino. And the entrepreneur is 24 years old. And his name is Steve Jobs. And the company that he's invented is Apple, which is this little startup that makes little computers. And all of his engineers have told him, you've got to go and see what's going on at Xerox PARC. So he goes to Xerox PARC on that December day, and he gets a tour of the facility, right? And they show him this gadget and this gadget. And finally they come to the Alto, this personal computer, and he looks at this little thing next to it and says, what's that? And they say, well, that's a mouse. And then he looks in the screen and he says, what are those? And he said, well, those are icons. Right? Everyone to that point, or at least in his computers that he'd been making, are computers where when you wanted the computer to do something, you typed in on a command line, and you hit, the whatever it was, and that whatever button corresponded back then, and it was this long, complex process. And they showed him how actually you could do it way easier. You just move your mouse, and click on an icon, and boom, it's done. And he can't believe what he's seeing. He's literally floored. He starts jumping up and down and saying, oh my goodness, this is the future of the computer. I mean, this is the way everything's going to be. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Why haven't you done anything with this? And they kind of look at him like they don't know what he's talking about. And he jumps in his car and he races back to Cupertino, and he goes to his engineers who are in the midst of working on a new computer that's going to be called the Lisa, which is a very conventional computer. And he says, stop everything. Throw it out. We're starting over from scratch. We're going to do a graphical user interface. And they go, what's that? The icons on the screen. And they say, but you told us to do this the other way. He said, I was wrong, right? We're using this idea. And he goes to his designers and he says, I want a mouse. And they say, what's a mouse? We can get you a mouse. Run around the office. No. I want a little thing. I want a little box, and I want to move it around and have it move the cursor on the screen. And only I saw one. I saw it at Xerox PARC. Only theirs cost $300. I want mine to cost $15. And I want it to work for a year, and I want it to work on Formica and whatever surface you can imagine. And they go and they make that, and they finally put all those things together, the graphical user interface and the mouse, and Apple comes out with the Macintosh. Still the most iconic product in the history of Apple Computer, one of the most iconic products in the history of Silicon Valley, and certainly the breakthrough that launches Apple onto the trajectory that they have been on ever since. Now think about that story along the lines of the story I just told you about RMA, right? It's very, very similar. Xerox has built a culture for invention. They're the United States. They have brought together a bunch of really, really brilliant people, given them lots and lots of money and lots of time and a huge research budget and a palatial headquarters in the hills above Stanford University, and they've told them to do everything they can to imagine the future, and that's exactly what they do. But Xerox ends up capitalizing on none of it. And why is that? Because a culture built for invention is not optimized for implementation. What happens when you get a bunch of really brilliant PhDs together and ask them to design a computer? Well, they designed the computer that the Xerox came up with and finally went to market with in 1980 called the Xerox Star, which cost $16,000 in 1980 money, right? That's what happens when you have PhD geniuses design a computer. They give you a perfect computer that costs $16,000, right? And what happens when you're Xerox and you're steeped in a culture of sending tons and tons of genius PhDs to work on hugely complex topics? Well, you think that's a good idea. And it takes you 10 years to take an idea from its inception to implementation. Meanwhile, what was the real computer business like? Well, it was a business where you couldn't sell anything for $16,000. And we're 10 years from idea to development is a ludicrously long time. And who understands that? Well, a 24-year-old guy who's running a startup, who doesn't have unlimited budgets, who doesn't have the luxury of time. He's desperate, right? He's put out a computer called the Apple II, which isn't a very good computer. He's building another one called the Lisa, which doesn't look like it's going to be that much better, right? He's Israel. He's running around desperately trying to find an answer to his problem, and he sees it, and boom, light bulb goes on. You know, you can do a kind of perfect RMA analysis of the history of the mouse. It's kind of interesting. The mouse, the concept of the mouse is invented by a guy named Doug Engelbart in the late 60s at SRI in Stanford, California. Engelbart is Russia. The first operational mouse is made at enormous cost and expense and brilliance at Xerox PARC in the 1970s. Xerox PARC is the United States. The first commercial mouse is put into practice at a cost of $15 by Steve Jobs, who is Israel. Right? He's the last to the party, but he's the most successful one, just as Israel was the most successful one. In fact, when you look at the history of Apple, of course, they're always last to the party, right? He wasn't just last with Windows and last with the mouse. He was way late with the smartphone. He was way late with the MP3 player, and he was way late with the iPad. Right? This is a man who was made a business out of being late, not being early. So when I was at a dinner party in Palo Alto, and someone told me the story, it's possibly apocryphal, but Larry Ellison, the head of Oracle Software, bought himself a G5. And he's a very kind of hands-on, practical engineering, visual kind of guy. And he looks at the interior of the G5 and he decides, it's all wrong. They don't understand how to do a plane. And so he brings in craftsmen from Italy and imports rare materials from Africa, spends $1 gazillion in a year completely rethinking the structure of the cabin and puts this special African hardwood on the walls and redoes the doors so they glide in and out, and there's like one button that opens and one button that closes. There's all this time until it's perfect. He calls up his friend, his best friend, Steve Jobs, and says, I want you to come and see my plane. Jobs shows up, walks into the plane, and wearing his turban. Sits in like the captain's chair, and just looks, says nothing. Half an hour, just looking. Then quietly leaves, goes home, buys himself a G5, spends the next year spending $1 gazillion, like making it to the specifications, calls up his friend Larry Ellison and says, I want you to come and see my plane. Ellison goes over, climbs the stairs, walks in, and it's exactly like his plane. Every single thing he did a year ago, Jobs had done with his plane, with two exceptions. One is that, you know how Ellison had used that fine African hardwood grain? It wasn't quite right. What Jobs done is change it just a little bit, and actually the effect was way better. And also, remember how the doors that opened and shut, Ellison, two buttons, one to open, one to close? Jobs has one button. And when it's open, you hit it, and it closes, and when it's closed, you hit it. And Ellison looks around and realizes there's these subtle differences, and he buries his head in his hands, and he says, your plane is better. This is the man, Steve Jobs, who is the archetypal entrepreneur of our age, right? And he is not an innovator, right? He's the guy who comes second or third and makes it better. And that, to me, is an extraordinarily important observation. Now, let's think about this. A couple of implications of this phenomenon. Why is it? So what are the reasons why, additional reasons why? And what sort of lessons can we draw from this paradoxical fact that the people who seem to make all the money are the ones who come along second or third and not first? The first thing is that I think it's a lot easier to figure out technological solutions than it is to figure out what customers want. Right? So if you look at the rise of the personal computer, what you see is, Xerox's assumption in the early days at Xerox PARC is that what they're building is an office application, an enterprise application. They're going to sell it the same way they sell their huge Xerox machines to very large corporate clients. And that's why they're thinking $16,000 for a computer machine, right? Because they're used to selling copiers for $40,000. And that's because, the reason they have that assumption is not because they are stupid. It's because at that point in the early 1970s, we didn't know what the computer was going to be for, the personal computer. No one did. Least of all consumers. It took a while. It took 5, 6, 7 years of people playing with the idea of the personal computer to make them understand that this had extraordinary potential in the consumer marketplace. So who gets the value of that learning curve? Well, the person who waits, right? The person who's third in or second in, not first in. Steve Jobs, who's able to observe with the benefit of hindsight what has been learned about the practical value of the personal computer, the potential of the personal computer over the course of the second half of the 1970s. You can see the same thing with social media. Who's the first big player in social media? Right? Well, it's Friendster. What is Friendster? It's basically a souped-up dating site. Their impression was that the thing that we would want out of a social networking website was a way to connect with other people who we wanted to sleep with. Right? Now, they added some other bells and whistles, but at the core, their thinking was about romance. Well, then along came number 2, which was MySpace, which said, actually, it's going to be a little bit more than that. You probably want to have a place where you can put your music, or you can sort of dump various artifacts of your life, and as a better way of representing who you are to people who want to sleep with you. Well, what happens over the course of the public experimentation with social media over the course of those first 5 years? We discovered it's much more than that. That in our first imagining, we only captured a fraction of the real utility of these websites. So Facebook, which comes along third, late to the party, is the one that gets the benefit of that learning and understands it's not about dating, it's not about a place just to dump your personal artifacts. It's actually an informational platform, a wholly new media platform that can compete with all of the existing platforms and win. See the same thing with the e-reader. Exactly the same story. Who's first with the e-reader? Sony. And by the way, if you go back and look at those Sony e-readers, they were amazing. As a piece of technology, they still remain a kind of brilliant accomplishment. Did they transform the marketplace? No. Why? Because at the time that Sony came out with their e-reader, at the time they pioneered that market, none of us understood what the e-reader was all about. We thought it was about the piece of technology we hold in our hands. It's not. It's about a seamless connectivity to a digital bookstore. It's about access to the books. And if you can deliver seamless access to the books, then you'll win the day. Who gets the benefit of that understanding? Well, Amazon does, right? Why? Because they're not first. Because they're third. Because they come in late and get to get the full benefit of that necessary process of evolution. Second thought. The thing that's really interesting when you look at the Apple and RNA examples is you realize how much innovation, or profitable innovation, the people who make the most of new ideas, how much that is a mass strategy and not an elite strategy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at this, a lot of really great thinking that's gone on, obviously, about the Industrial Revolution. We've had a couple of years to think about it. And one of the questions people in the Industrial Revolution who study it always ask is, why does it happen in England? What's England's great advantage? And there's a series of really great papers that have been written by this historian. He divides technological innovation into 3 steps. Inventors, and then tweakers, and then implementers. And he says, is England's advantage with inventors? Do they have more of the people who make that big conceptual breakthrough? And the answer is no. They have a lot of great inventors, but that's not where their real advantage is. Their real advantage is with the tweakers and the implementers. They don't have more geniuses than Germany